You ever feel like you're living in a perfect world, only to find out it's built on lies? That was me until our 26th wedding anniversary. I remember the day so clearly. I planned a simple, quiet evening. After all these years, we had grown to appreciate the calm rather than the chaos. Or so I thought. She came home late, claiming she had an emergency at work. It wasn't the first time her job had interfered with our plans, so I didn't think much of it at first. But something was off. Her hair was slightly disheveled, makeup faded, and there was a faint scent of unfamiliar cologne. "Sorry, honey," she said, her voice barely masking the tension. "There was a situation at the office and I couldn't get out of it." I wanted to believe her. Hell, I did believe her for about 5 minutes. But as she slipped into the bathroom, I felt a gnawing in my gut. This wasn't the woman I knew. Or maybe this was exactly who she was, and I had been blind to it all along. I paced the living room, replaying our evening in my head. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside me, lightning flashing through the windows, illuminating the shadows of doubt. Then my phone buzzed, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a text from an unknown number. I opened it, and my world collapsed in an instant. It was a picture of her, naked, in bed with another man. My heart pounded as I scrolled through more images and messages. There was no mistaking it. My wife had spent our anniversary night having sex with her lover. Rage boiled within me, but I kept calm. My mind was racing, but one thought was crystal clear: I needed revenge. Not the impulsive kind, but something calculated, something that would leave a lasting scar just like the one she'd just carved into me. I walked to the kitchen, grabbed the trash bin, and fished out our wedding photo album. Then I took off my wedding ring and dropped it into the trash. The metallic clink echoed louder than thunder. I took a picture of it and sent it to her without a word. She didn't reply, but I heard a stifled sob from the bathroom. Good, I thought. Let the guilt eat at her, it is only the beginning. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I planned. I wasn't just going to end this marriage, I was going to dismantle it piece by piece until there was nothing left but regret and ruins. The storm outside raged on, but inside, I was calm. I knew what had to be done. The morning after was eerily quiet. She emerged from the bedroom with puffy eyes, the evidence of a sleepless night etched across her face. She didn't mention the ring or the picture I sent. Instead, she moved through the house like a ghost, barely acknowledging my presence. But I wasn't ready to talk, not yet. I needed her to sit in her own guilt a little longer, to stew in the discomfort of what she'd done. Besides, I was still putting the pieces of my plan together. I didn't want to rush into anything and risk missing a chance to make her pay. Instead, I played the part of the confused, distant husband, keeping my interactions with her brief and emotionless. Over breakfast, I asked her how her emergency went. The subtle emphasis on emergency made her wince, and I could tell she was struggling to come up with a coherent response. It was stressful, she muttered, avoiding eye contact. But it is handled now. I nodded, suppressing the urge to laugh. Handled was a good way to put it, I suppose. But there was a dark satisfaction in knowing that this little charade was unraveling before her eyes, and she had no idea just how deep the knife would go. I went about my day as usual, heading to work and immersing myself in the routine. But my mind was far from the tasks at hand. I was focused on my next move, thinking of ways to chip away at her life the same way she had chipped away at my trust. It started with her friends. She had a close-knit group she'd been with since college, and they were fiercely protective of one another. I knew that if I could get them on my side, or at least plant some doubts, she'd start losing the support system she'd need when the shit really hit the fan. I spent the next few days gathering evidence, screenshots of those incriminating texts and photos, but I wasn't going to dump them on her friends right away. I needed to be strategic, so I started small, casually mentioning to one of her closest friends that I'd noticed some changes in my wife's behavior lately. "I don't know. Maybe it's just stress," I said over a drink with Sarah, her best friend. "But she's been so distant, and there's this weird vibe I can shake. Have you noticed anything?" Sarah looked concerned, but not overly so. She has mentioned work being tough, but nothing beyond that. Maybe you two just need a break, some time together to reconnect. Yeah, maybe, I replied, pretending to mull it over. But it's been going on for a while now. Sometimes I wonder if there's more to it, you know? Something she's not telling me. That planted the first seed. If Sarah started to suspect anything even a little, it would spread through their group like wildfire. Women like them shared everything, and I knew it wouldn't be long before the doubt took root. That night, I returned home to find her waiting for me. She looked nervous, twisting her hands in her lap as if she was trying to gather the courage to say something. I need to talk to you, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Go on. She took a deep breath. I feel like there is something off between us. We've been so distant lately, and I'm worried. I want to work through this. I love you, and I don't want to lose what we have. There it was, her attempt to patch up the cracks, to pretend that one heartfelt conversation could erase the betrayal. But it was too late for that. Way too late. I think you're right, I replied coolly. There is something off, but I'm not sure if it's something that can be fixed. Her eyes widened, panic flickering behind them. What do you mean? I leaned forward, holding her gaze. I mean, trust is a fragile thing. Once it is broken, it's almost impossible to mend. And right now, I am not sure if I can trust you. She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. I am not ready to talk about this right now. I need time to think, and maybe you should too. I stood up and left her sitting there, stunned and speechless. The guilt, the fear, it was all starting to eat at her. But this was only the beginning. I wanted her to feel what I was feeling, to understand the depth of her betrayal, to drown in the same pain she had inflicted on me. The seeds were planted, and it wouldn't be long before they started to bear fruit. And when they did, the destruction would be beautiful. The tension between us became palpable. Each day, I watched as she tried to piece together what had gone wrong, as if she didn't know that her own actions had triggered the unraveling. Every time she looked at me with those pleading eyes, I could see the cracks in her resolve widening. It was only a matter of time before she broke. I started leaving home earlier than usual and coming back late, spending more time away from her. This wasn't just to distance myself emotionally, I was laying the groundwork for the next phase of my plan. She began texting me more often, asking where I was, if I was okay, and when I'd be home. I replied sparingly, just enough to keep her hanging, but not enough to soothe her growing anxiety. My absence made her clingier. The more she tried to pull me back, the further I withdrew, feeding her paranoia. It was almost amusing to watch her flounder, to see the confident woman I'd known crumble under the weight of her own guilt and suspicion. One night, I decided to add another layer to my revenge. I started an affair of my own, but not with just anyone. I reached out to a woman named Karen, a former fling from before I met my wife. She was gorgeous, smart, and most importantly, single. We had ended things amicably years ago, but I knew there was still a spark between us. I could feel it in the way she responded to my initial text. Her curiosity piqued when I suggested meeting up. Is everything okay? She asked when we met at a cozy, dimly lit bar downtown. You seem different. I smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach my eyes. Just been dealing with a lot lately. Marriage stuff. She raised an eyebrow, and I could see the concern turn into something else, something more interested. Marriage stuff? I didn't think you and your wife had problems. We didn't, T. Or at least, I didn't think we did. But things have changed. The conversation flowed easily after that. Karen was more than willing to listen, offering sympathetic nods and gentle touches on my arm. It didn't take long before the sympathy turned into something more physical. We ended up back at her place, where the tension between us finally broke. The sex was good, but it wasn't just about that. It was about taking control, about having something that was mine, untouched by betrayal. And in a way, it was about keeping my options open. If things with my wife blew up in spectacular fashion, which I intended them to, it wouldn't hurt to have someone else to turn to. After that night, I felt a new sense of calm. While my wife was drowning in guilt and doubt, I was already moving on. I kept the affair with Karen going, careful not to leave any traces that my wife might find. But I didn't need to worry too much. She was too focused on the imaginary ghosts of her own indiscretions to notice what was happening right under her nose. As the days passed, the cracks between us deepened. She kept trying to initiate conversations, to repair the damage she couldn't even fully comprehend. One evening, she made a last-ditch effort, cooking my favorite meal and setting the table with candles and wine, hoping to rekindle something that had long since died. "Can we please talk?" she asked, her voice trembling as she placed a hand over mine. I looked at her, at the desperation in her eyes, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "Talk about what?" I asked, pulling my hand away. She hesitated, tears welling up. "About us. I feel like I'm losing you and I don't know how to fix it." I stared at her for a long moment before responding. "Maybe some things can be fixed. Maybe they were just broken." Her face crumpled, and she let out a choked sob. "Please, I love you. Whatever it is, we can work through it. Can we?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "What if it's not just one thing? What if it's everything?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't understand." "Maybe you should start trying to," I said, my tone ice cold. "Maybe you should think long and hard about what you've done, about the choices you've made." She looked at me, eyes wide with fear and realization slowly dawning. But before she could say anything more, I stood up, leaving the table without another word. I could feel her gaze on my back, the weight of her despair heavy in the air. That night I didn't come home. Instead, I stayed at Karen S.'s place, where the bed was warm, the sheets didn't reek of betrayal, and the woman beside me was free of the lies that had poisoned my marriage. But I wasn't done yet. I knew my wife was on the edge, but I wanted her to fall. I wanted her to crash and burn the way she had made my world collapse, and I knew exactly how to push her over. The next morning, I returned home to find her sitting on the couch, looking like she hadn't slept at all. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hair was a tangled mess. She barely acknowledged me as I walked past her to the bedroom. It was as if she had already resigned herself to the fact that something was horribly wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to confront it head on. I showered, dressed, and went about my morning routine as if nothing had changed. But something had. The balance of power between us had shifted completely. She was no longer the confident, composed woman I had married. She was fragile, crumbling under the weight of her own guilt and fear, and I was the one pulling the strings now. As I headed out the door for work, she finally spoke, her voice small and tentative. "Where were you last night?" I paused, turning to face her. There was no anger in her question, just a quiet desperation. She needed an answer, something to anchor herself in the storm of uncertainty I had created, but I wasn't going to give her the comfort she craved. "Out," I replied, my tone flat and uninterested. Her brow furrowed, and she bit her lip, clearly struggling to hold back the questions that were bubbling up inside her. But I didn't give her the chance to ask. I walked out the door, leaving her in silence. Over the next few days, I kept up the charade. I spent more nights away from home, sometimes with Karen, other times just driving aimlessly, thinking about what had brought us to this point. But every time I returned, I found her more broken than before. She was trying so hard to fix things in her own way. She started leaving little notes for me, apologies written in careful, trembling handwriting. "I am sorry for whatever I've done. Please let us talk," one note read. Another simply said, "I love you. I am scared." I didn't respond to any of them. I let her stew in her own thoughts, her own guilt, while I continued to pull the strings from behind the scenes. It wasn't long before her friends started noticing something was off. Sarah called me one afternoon, her voice laced with concern. "Hey, I just wanted to check in," she began. "Your wife has been really distant lately. She seems different. Is everything okay between you two?" I could almost hear the suspicion in her voice, the seeds I had planted starting to take root. This was the moment I had been waiting for. "We are going through a rough patch," I admitted, careful to keep my tone neutral. "I've noticed she's been acting strange too. I think she might be hiding something from me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Hiding something? Like what?" "I'm not sure," I said, letting the uncertainty linger. but I am worried. We've been married for so long and I thought I knew her, but now I'm not so sure." Sarah sighed, clearly troubled by what I was saying. "Maybe it's just stress. I mean, everyone goes through tough times in their marriage, right?" "Maybe," I agreed, though my words carried a different weight. "But if there's something more, something she's not telling me, I don't know if I can handle that." The conversation ended on a somber note, but I knew that the doubt I had sown would spread quickly. Sarah would talk to the others, and soon enough my wife would find herself isolated, her friends pulling away as they questioned her honesty and loyalty. It was only a matter of time before she'd be completely alone, with no one to turn to but me, and by then, I'd be ready to deliver the final blow. But for now, I let the cracks widen. I continued to distance myself, my indifference driving her deeper into despair. She tried to reach out to me, to bridge the growing chasm between us, but every time she did, I shut her down with cold, detached responses. "I don't have time for this," I'd say when she tried to talk to me about her feelings. Or, "I am tired. Can we not do this right now?" I knew my dismissiveness hurt her, but that was the point. I wanted her to feel the pain she had caused me, to understand the depth of her betrayal. It wasn't long before the strain started showing in other areas of her life. She became more withdrawn at work, her performance slipping as she struggled to keep up the facade of normalcy. Her colleagues started noticing too, whispering behind her back, wondering what had happened to the woman who had once been so composed and put together. And then the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Late one night, as I was lying in bed beside Karen, my phone buzzed with a notification. I glanced at the screen and saw an email from my wife's work account only. It wasn't addressed to me. It was an email she had accidentally sent to me instead of her lover. I opened it, and my heart pounded as I read the words she had meant for him. It was a plea, a desperate attempt to cling to whatever twisted connection they had shared. "I miss you," she had written. "I don't know what to do anymore. Everything is falling apart and I can stop it. Please tell me you still care." I stared at the screen, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. She was flailing, grasping at straws to hold on to something that was already gone. And that was when I knew she was ready to break. It was time to push her over the edge. I sat there staring at the words on my phone, the final nail in the coffin of whatever had once existed between us. It was almost too easy. Her desperation was laid bare in that email. She was clinging to a man who was never going to save her, who probably didn't even care about her the way she thought he did. It was pathetic, really, but it was exactly what I needed. The next morning, I decided to set my plan into motion. I forwarded the email to her work address with a simple message: "You sent this to the wrong person." Then I went about my day as usual, waiting for the fallout. I didn't have to wait long. She called me from work, her voice trembling. Did you see the email I sent you?" "Yeah," I replied casually, as if we were discussing the weather. "Seems like you made a mistake." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear her heart pounding through the phone. I can explain," she stammered, her voice thick with panic. "I am sure you can," I said, still keeping my tone even, "but I'm not interested in hearing it right now." Another pause, this one even longer. She was at a loss for words, scrambling to find a way to undo what she had done, but there was no undoing it. Not anymore. "Please," she finally whispered. "Can we talk about this when I get home?" I considered her request for a moment, letting the silence stretch out until it became almost unbearable. Then I agreed. "Fine. We'll talk when you get home." That evening I made sure I was there when she walked through the door. She looked like she had aged 10 years in a day. Her face was pale, eyes hollow, and she moved with the hesitancy of someone walking to the gallows. She barely had time to set her things down before I spoke. "So you want to explain?" She flinched at my tone but nodded, tears already welling up in her eyes. "It was a mistake," she started, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was lonely, and it just happened." I scoffed. "Lonely, really? That's your excuse?" "It's not an excuse," she cried, the tears now spilling over. "It's the truth. I didn't want to hurt you. I swear I didn't. But I was so lost, and he was there, and I made a terrible mistake." I watched her crumble, her words spilling out in a frantic attempt to salvage what was left of our marriage. But there was nothing left to salvage. This wasn't about her infidelity anymore. It was about the satisfaction of watching her suffer. "You didn't just make a mistake," I said, my voice cold and unforgiving. "You destroyed everything we had. You threw away 26 years of marriage for a cheap fling, and now you expect me to forgive you? To move on like nothing happened?" She shook her head violently, sobbing uncontrollably. "No, I don't expect that. I just want a chance to make things right. Please, let me try to fix this." "Fix this?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "There's nothing to fix. You broke it, and now it is broken forever." She collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. Her body shook with the force of her sobs, and for a moment I almost felt pity. Almost. But then I remembered the images, the texts, the lies. I remembered the cold emptiness I felt when I realized the woman I had loved and trusted had betrayed me in the worst possible way. I wasn't going to give her an easy out. She needed to feel the full weight of what she'd done. "There's one thing I need to know," I said, my voice cutting through her cries. "Do you love him?" Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and fear. No, I don't love him. It was just a mistake." I leaned in closer, my gaze boring into hers. "Are you sure? Because from where I am standing, it looks like you are in love with him. You were willing to risk everything for him, weren't you?" She shook her head again, but the hesitation in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't sure, and that uncertainty was going to be her undoing. "I don't believe you," I said, my words cold and final. "I think you do love him, and I think that's why you did what you did." "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't love him. I love you. I have always loved you." "Funny way of showing it," I replied, my tone dripping with sarcasm. "But you know what? It doesn't matter anymore. Because whatever you feel, whether it's love or guilt or regret, it's not enough. It's never going to be enough." She broke down completely then, sobbing into her hands, her entire body trembling with the force of her despair. I watched her for a moment, the woman I had once loved reduced to a pitiful, broken mess. But I felt nothing. No pity, no sadness, no anger, just a cold, hollow satisfaction. This was what I wanted. This was the revenge I had been craving, but I wasn't done yet. There was still more to come. "I want a divorce," I said, my voice steady and calm. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock. "No, please, no." "It's too late," I continued, ignoring her pleas. "I have already filed the papers. You will be hearing from my lawyer soon." Her face crumpled, and she let out a wail of despair that echoed through the room. But I didn't flinch. I didn't care. This was her punishment, and she was going to suffer through every second of it. I stood up, leaving her sobbing on the couch, and walked out of the room. I needed space, time to think, time to plan my next move. Because this wasn't just about ending the marriage. This was about destroying everything she had left. As I walked away, I heard her voice, broken and desperate, calling after me. "Please, Dawn, to leave me, please." But I didn't turn back. This was only the beginning of her downfall, and I was going to enjoy every moment of it. The days that followed were a blur of legal meetings and silent dinners. The divorce papers were served to her at work, just as ID planned. I could only imagine the look on her face when the courier handed her that envelope in front of her colleagues, the weight of what she'd lost sinking in as she realized this was real. When she came home that evening, she didn't say a word. She just stood in the doorway holding the divorce papers, her eyes hollow and red-rimmed. It was clear she'd been crying all day, but I couldn't bring myself to care. She had done this to herself. I could see her gathering the courage to speak, but I cut her off before she could even start. "I've made my decision," I said, my tone final. "There's nothing more to discuss." She flinched, as if ID slapped her, but she nodded, the fight completely drained out of her. For a moment, I thought she might try to plead with me again, but instead she just set the papers on the table and walked past me, disappearing into the bedroom without another word. The silence between us became oppressive. We moved through the house like strangers, avoiding each other's gaze, speaking only when absolutely necessary. But beneath that silence, I knew she was falling apart. I could see it in the way she carried herself, in the way her hands shook when she thought I wasn't looking, in the haunted expression that had become her constant companion. But I wasn't done yet. I still had one more move to make. It was time to destroy her relationship with her lover. I'd indeed been waiting for the right moment, and it finally came when I intercepted another one of their emails. This time, it was him reaching out, trying to soothe her nerves, trying to keep her from unraveling completely. "Don't worry," he wrote. "We'll figure this out. I'll always be here for you." His words were meant to comfort her, but they only fueled my anger. He was still there, still lingering in the background, still trying to keep his hold on her. But I was about to rip that comfort away from her, just like she had ripped away my trust. I drafted an email from her account, mimicking her tone and style perfectly. It wasn't difficult. I spent years reading her messages, understanding the way she communicated. When I was done, I read over the message one last time, a cruel smile tugging at my lips. "I can't do this anymore," I wrote, pretending to be her. "I thought I loved you, but now I realize it was just a mistake. I'm trying to save my marriage, and I can have you in my life. Please don't contact me again." I hit send and sat back, satisfied. The trap was set. That evening, I waited. I knew it wouldn't be long before her phone buzzed with a reply from him. And sure enough, as we sat in the same stifling silence that had become our norm, I heard her phone vibrate on the kitchen counter. She picked it up, her eyes widening as she read the message. I could see the confusion and panic wash over her face as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. "What is wrong?" I asked, feigning concern. She looked up at me, her face pale. I don't know," he is saying. "He is saying I told him to leave me alone, that I'm trying to save our marriage." But I never said that. I shrugged, keeping my expression neutral. "Maybe you did and you just don't remember. Stress can do strange things to people." "No," she insisted, shaking her head. "I would never say that to him. I need to fix this. I need to talk to him." "Are you sure that's a good idea?" I asked, my voice dripping with false concern. "I thought you wanted to work on us, on our marriage. How can you do that if you're still talking to him?" Her face crumpled and she seemed to shrink into herself. I don't know what to do." "You need to make a choice," I said, pressing the advantage. "Him or me. You can have both." The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I could see the conflict raging inside her, the pull between the man she thought she loved and the life she was desperately trying to salvage. But I knew she was too weak, too broken to make a decision on her own. "I just want to fix this," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "Then stop talking to him," I replied, my tone sharp. "Delete his number, block his email, cut him out completely. If you are serious about fixing this, that is the first step." She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen of her phone, but eventually she did as I said. She deleted his contact information, blocked his email, and sat there, staring at the blank screen as if waiting for some kind of relief that would never come. But I wasn't finished. That night, after she had cried herself to sleep in the guest room she had retreated to, I sent one final message from her account to him, just to twist the knife a little deeper. "I've made my decision," I wrote. "I am choosing my husband. Please respect my wishes and don't to contact me again." I knew it would crush him, just as it was crushing her. And in that moment, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction, knowing that I had taken away the one thing she thought she could rely on, leaving her utterly and completely alone. The next morning she was a ghost of herself, moving through the house in a daze, her eyes red and swollen from the endless tears. She didn't speak to me, didn't even look at me. It was as if the life had been drained out of her, leaving only a shell behind. But that was exactly what I wanted. She had betrayed me, shattered my trust, and now I had done the same to her. Her world was in ruins, and there was no one left to pick up the pieces, not even me. It was time to finalize the divorce, the last nail in the coffin of our marriage, the final irreversible step in tearing down everything we had built together. And I was ready. The day we finalized the divorce was cold and gray, matching the somber mood that hung between us like a dark cloud. We arrived at the courthouse separately, a clear signal that there was no longer any us to speak of. I had anticipated the moment for weeks, planning each detail with the precision of a surgeon. But as we sat across from each other, waiting for our case to be called, I saw something in her eyes that made me pause. She looked utterly defeated, as if the weight of everything had finally crushed her. The strong, confident woman I had married was gone, replaced by someone who was barely holding on. Part of me, a very small part, wondered if I had gone too far. But that part was quickly drowned out by the memory of her betrayal, of the nights she had spent with him while I waited at home, clueless and trusting. I pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand. The proceedings were quick and clinical, our lives reduced to a series of legal documents and signatures. The Judge's voice droned on as we nodded in all the right places, agreeing to the terms that would officially end our marriage. I had made sure the settlement was fair, at least on paper. She got the house, most of the savings, and her car. I didn't need much, I just wanted to be free of her. When it was over, we stood outside the courthouse in the biting wind, an awkward silence hanging between us. I looked at her one last time, expecting her to say something, anything, but she just stared at the ground, tears welling up in her eyes. I took a deep breath and broke the silence. It's done. We are done. She nodded, a single tear escaping and rolling down her cheek. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. I almost felt something then, a pang of regret maybe, or perhaps just pity, but I quickly shoved it down, refusing to let myself feel anything for her. It's too late for that. She didn't respond, just wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold herself together. I watched her for a moment longer, searching for any remnants of the woman I had once loved, but there was nothing left. Goodbye, I said, turning to walk away, eager to put as much distance between us as possible. But before I could take more than a few steps, she spoke again, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and desperation. What am I supposed to do now? She asked, her eyes pleading with me for some kind of direction, some kind of hope. I stopped and turned back to her, my expression hard. You figure it out, just like I had to. She flinched at my words, and for a moment I thought she might break down completely. But she just stood there, trembling in the cold, her eyes filled with a hopelessness that matched the sky above us. Without another word, I walked away, leaving her standing alone in front of the courthouse. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I needed to be done with this chapter of my life, with her. But as I drove away, a strange emptiness settled in my chest. The satisfaction I had expected, the sense of closure, wasn't there. All I felt was a hollow ache, a nagging thought that maybe I hadn't won anything at all. The next few weeks were a blur of moving out, settling into my new place and trying to adjust to a life without her. It was strange, living alone after so many years of marriage. The silence in my new apartment was deafening, the nights long and restless. I threw myself into work, into my affair with Karen, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how busy I kept myself, that hollow feeling remained. I heard from Sarah a few times. She was worried about my ex-wife, said she wasn't coping well, that she had withdrawn completely from their friend group. I pretended to be concerned, offered to talk to her if she needed it. But Sarah knew as well as I did that there was nothing left to say. Then came the night that everything changed. I was sitting in my apartment, a drink in hand, half watching some mindless show on TV, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. Frowning, I opened it, expecting some spam message or wrong number. But what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a picture of my ex-wife, sitting on the edge of a bed in a dark room, her face illuminated by the harsh flash of the camera. Her eyes were red and puffy, her expression vacant, and in her hand was a bottle of pills. The message below it was brief but chilling. Goodbye. Panic surged through me as I jumped up, dialing her number with trembling fingers. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. I grabbed my keys and rushed out the door, my mind racing. I had no idea where she was, but I knew I had to find her, to stop her from doing something irreversible. I called Sarah on the way, asking if she knew where my ex might be, but she didn't answer either. Desperation clawed at me as I sped through the streets, heading toward the house we had once shared. It was the only place I could think of, the only place she might have gone. When I arrived, the house was dark, the windows black and empty. I pounded on the door, shouting her name, but there was no response. My heart was in my throat as I fumbled with the spare key I still had, finally managing to unlock the door. The silence inside was oppressive, suffocating. I called out for her, my voice echoing through the empty rooms, but there was no answer. I searched every room, my fear growing with each passing second, until finally I reached the bedroom. The sight that greeted me stopped me cold. She was lying on the bed, the empty pill bottle clutched in her hand, her face pale and lifeless. The breath caught in my throat as I rushed to her side, shaking her, calling her name, but she didn't respond. She was gone. I collapsed beside her, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. The woman I had spent nearly 3 decades with, the woman I had loved, hated, and ultimately destroyed, was gone. And in that moment all the anger, all the bitterness evaporated, leaving only an overwhelming sense of loss. I don't know how long I sat there, holding her cold hand, staring at her lifeless face. Time seemed to stand still, the world outside fading into nothingness. I had wanted revenge, had wanted her to suffer as I had suffered. But I never wanted this. I never wanted her dead. Eventually, I forced myself to move, to pick up the phone and call for help. But as I waited for the ambulance to arrive, a terrible realization settled over me. I had pushed her to this. I had destroyed her life, taken away everything she had, and now she was gone because of it. And now, no matter what I did, I would have to live with that for the rest of my life. The night closed in around me as I walked, the road stretching out into the darkness like a path to nowhere. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, maybe an end to the suffering, maybe some kind of redemption. But deep down, I knew that neither was waiting for me out here. There was no redemption for what I had done, only the cold, unyielding truth that I had destroyed everything that had ever mattered to me. The stars overhead flickered dimly, distant and indifferent to the turmoil inside me. I kept walking, the rhythmic crunch of gravel under my shoes the only sound in the stillness. My thoughts circled like vultures, picking at the remnants of my sanity, but I didn't try to stop them. I let the guilt and regret wash over me, consuming me whole. At some point I realized I had no idea where I was. The road had twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the wilderness. The only light came from the pale moon, casting long shadows that danced eerily across the landscape. I felt like I was the only person left in the world, a fitting punishment for the man I had become. I finally stopped when I reached the edge of a cliff, the ground dropping away suddenly into a deep ravine below. The wind whipped through the trees, the air cold and sharp against my skin. I stood there, staring down into the abyss, the darkness below calling to me like an old friend. This was it, the end of the road, the only way to escape the ghosts that had been haunting me since that terrible night. A way to make the pain stop. I took a step closer to the edge, peering down into the void. The fall was long enough to ensure that I wouldn't survive it. There was a strange comfort in that thought, in the finality of it all. No more guilt, no more regrets, no more endless nights of torment. But as I stood there teetering on the brink, a memory flashed through my mind. The first time I met her, my ex-wife, back when we were just kids, so full of life and hope. I remembered the way she used to laugh, the sound of it like music, the way her eyes lit up when she saw me. The way we had built a life together, one brick at a time, until I had torn it all down with my own hands. I thought of her lying on that bed, the life drained from her eyes, and the part of me that had loved her for all those years screamed in agony. I had taken everything from her, her dignity, her happiness, her life. And now, here I was, ready to take my own life to escape the consequences of my actions. It felt like the final betrayal. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, doubling me over as the full weight of what I had done came crashing down. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, tears streaming down my face as the truth tore through me like a knife. I had become the monster I had accused her of being. In my quest for revenge, I had lost everything that made me human, and now, at the edge of this cliff, I was ready to throw away the one thing I had left my own life because I was too much of a coward to face what I had done. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't let her death be for nothing. I couldn't let the darkness win. I don't know how long I sat there, my head in my hands, sobbing like a child. The wind howled around me, the darkness closing in, but I stayed on that cliff, refusing to take the final step into the abyss. It wasn't redemption, and it wasn't forgiveness, but it was a decision to live with the consequences of my actions, no matter how much it hurt. Eventually, I stood up, my body trembling, my heart heavy with the weight of everything I had done. I turned away from the cliff, taking one last look at the darkness below before walking back the way I had come. It was a long walk, the night stretching out endlessly before me. But as I put one foot in front of the other, a strange sense of clarity began to settle over me. The guilt was still there, gnawing at my insides, but I realized that it was something I would have to carry with me for the rest of my life. It was the price I had to pay for what I had done. When I finally reached my car, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the landscape. I stood there for a moment, watching the sky turn from black to gray, the first rays of dawn breaking through the darkness. It wasn't much, but it was a new day. A chance, however small, to start over. To try and find some way to atone for the sins I had committed. I got into the car and drove back to the city, my mind heavy with the knowledge that I had a long road ahead of me. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know if I would ever find peace. But I knew that I couldn't run from it anymore. I couldn't take the easy way out. When I got back to my apartment, I found Karen waiting for me. She jumped up when she saw me, relief flooding her face as she ran to embrace me. But I didn't feel anything. I didn't deserve her concern, her love, not after everything I had done. "I was so worried," she whispered, holding me tightly. "Where did you go?" "Just needed to clear my head," I muttered, pulling away from her embrace. I couldn't look her in the eyes, couldn't face the kindness she was offering me, not after what I had almost done. She frowned, clearly sensing that something was wrong, but she didn't push it. Instead, she just nodded, her expression softening. "I am here for you, you know. Whatever you need." I nodded, but I knew that I couldn't accept her help. I couldn't let her into the darkness that was consuming me. This was something I had to face on my own. "Thanks," I said quietly, forcing a weak smile. "But I think I need some time to figure things out." She looked like she wanted to protest, but she just sighed and nodded again. "Okay. But Dante shut me out, all right? I am here when you are ready." I watched her leave, closing the door behind her, and the silence of the apartment settled over me like a heavy blanket. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where she had just been, before finally moving to the kitchen table. The letter I had written to Sarah was still there, untouched. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I opened it, reading over the confession I had poured onto the page. Every word felt like a dagger to my heart, a brutal reminder of the man I had become. I crumpled the letter in my hands, the paper tearing under the pressure, and then I threw it into the trash. Sarah didn't need to read it. No one needed to read it. This was my burden to bear, and I had to find a way to live with it. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and I slowly began to piece my life back together. It wasn't easy. There were days when the guilt threatened to consume me, when the memory of her lifeless body haunted my every thought. But I kept going, kept pushing forward, knowing that there was no other choice. I ended things with Karen, explaining that I needed to be alone, that I wasn't ready for a relationship. She was hurt, but she understood, and eventually, she stopped calling. I drifted away from everyone, isolating myself in my apartment, focusing on work and trying to find some semblance of normalcy. But no matter what I did, the guilt never went away. It was always there, a shadow lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to drag me back down into the darkness. And I knew that it always would be, because there was no escaping the consequences of my actions. There was no redemption, no forgiveness, only the long, lonely road ahead, stretching out into the unknown.